All right, well, let's go ahead and get started. So hello, everyone, and welcome to today's panel discussion, misinformation, social media, and free speech. Just to give you a rundown of today's panel, first we're gonna go ahead and welcome our panelists and have each of them tell them a bit about themselves. Then I'll be doing a very brief introduction to this topic. After, I have to ask each panelist a question and establish some foundational knowledge about today's topic. And finally, for the remainder of the period, we'll be fielding both questions from myself and comments and questions from you in the chat. Now, I will say that the topics we're talking about today might be a little bit emotionally charged. So there might be points of discussion in which you might find yourself disagreeing with some of the comments or opinions of myself, the panelists, or others in the chat. And that's definitely okay. I think in coming up with the idea of today's panel, our goal was not to get everyone to agree with a certain outlook or perspective, but rather to kind of learn from the informed perspectives of panelists and to really foster kind of a dialogue about these critical issues. That said, we always ask, remain civil in your questions and comments, both to our panelists and to one another. And speaking of questions and comments, please feel free to converse with each other in chat. But if you want to ask our panelists something specifically or make a comment specifically to them, please do so in the Q&A section to the right as we're going along. And I can't guarantee we're going to get to every question, but we'll do what we can. That said, I brought a stellar selection of educated perspectives from around the campus today to help really dig into some of these issues. And with that said, I'd like to have them introduce themselves now. And so I guess without further ado, if we can give like a virtual applause to today's panelists, and I'm going to ask each of them to introduce themselves right now. And I guess we can go along. This is displayed the same way as me, but I got Peter first on. If you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, Peter.
Peter Lupu, the philosophy department.
Good. All right. And Terry?
Hi, I'm Terry Desai. I teach political science, and these issues that we're talking about come up in just about every class that I teach: American government, civil rights and liberties, political ideology. So very timely. Thank you for inviting me, Sean.
Okay, good to have you. Jenna?
Hi, I'm Jenna Duncan. I use she, her pronouns. I am journalism and English faculty at Glendale Community College, and I still work on the site as a freelance reporter and editor.
And Jackie, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi. Yes, hi, I'm Jackie Higgins Daly. I'm library faculty here at GCC, and I am a former public librarian as well. And yeah, these are really, I also write for the American Library Association's intellectual freedom blog. So these are topics that are really important to me.
Excellent. And also on the line, we have Pam. She's gonna, not a panelist per se, but she's gonna help us out with some of the stuff on the chat. And then there's me, Sean. I'm a librarian here at GCC. And as one of us librarians, we've been doing a lot around fake news and misinformation. And so this is kind of one of the events where we're trying to really kind of foster a dialogue about some of these critical issues. So I'm really looking forward to it today. That being said, I do have just a brief introduction to kind of really frame the issue for the panel, and then we're going to ask some questions. So let me go ahead and start with that. All right, so just to kind of frame kind of the topic of today. So as we all know, on January 6th, a crowd of people invaded the Capitol, leaving 5 dead and a nation shaken. Many of these insurrectionists participated in this effort to overturn the will of voters based upon misinformation, or the false notions that there was a grand conspiracy in which the election was rigged or stolen from then President Trump. And yet the fallout from this event would only continue with both Twitter and Facebook deplatforming then President Trump a short while later, citing some of the election misinformation spread and potential future incitements to violence. For many, this was a little too late, but for others, this move was a vast overreach, as many, such as Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, called into question big tech's ability to silence people and perspectives with which it did not agree, calling for changes to the law. And he is not alone. In fact, politicians on both sides of the aisle, and even some social media companies, are looking to change the way speech on the internet is governed. And this event has become a real catalyst for some of the debates happening today in our country. Now, there are many different types of misinformation, from disinformation or the deliberate spread of false information to influence public opinion, such as propaganda or election interference. There's unintentional misinformation where someone may believe something, but it's actually false information. A good example is maybe like your crazy uncle sharing some sort of conspiracy theory on Facebook. There's coordinated inauthentic accounts, which include things like fake accounts and bot accounts used to sway public opinion and kind of drown out legitimate dialogue. There's also conspiracy theories such as QAnon or flat earthers apparently are making a comeback. There's also hate speech and pretty much any combination thereof interacting with each other. All that said, none of these things are necessarily new. Yet with the advent of social media, it seems as if all these elements have really gone mainstream due to the powerful ability of social media platforms to really amplify some of these messages. And it's difficult to underestimate the dangers of misinformation. For instance, in large part due to misinformation, about 1 in 4 Americans might refuse to actually get the COVID vaccine, putting kind of the whole society in danger and interfere with the society achieving maybe a herd immunity that might actually, prolong from the death and horror we've seen for over a year now. So this leaves us with a conundrum. So we live in a society in which free speech is both a legal right and a longstanding value. So when fighting misinformation, how do we ensure we are also protecting free speech rights? And this leads us to kind of the central question of the day. So how do we, as a society that values free speech, handle misinformation on social media? Now, if you ask me personally, I might not be able to answer this quite well. Luckily, I brought a lot of really smart friends to, really help along the way. And so we're going to really kind of open up this panel with a couple questions to them, and then later on, the questions from you. Again, just one quick reminder, go ahead and put your questions, if you have a question or comment to any of the panelists, put that in the Q&A, and we'll try to get to as many of those as we possibly can. All right, and I'd like to start off with a question to Jenna, our journalism faculty here. And that question is this: when it comes to the problem of misinformation, one of the things that seems to always come up is the notion that we live in a very fractured and partisan media environment in which people are not sure who to trust, what is misinformation, and where to go for reliable content. What do you think is the cause of some of these problems? What role do you think social media plays in this media landscape? And how can the average person discern between maybe quality journalism and more misinformation? So what do you think?
Thank you, Sean. This is an excellent question to get us started. First, to address the issue, I just want to point out that historically, we've often lived in a fractured or a society that has many different factions that may have a message that they want to get out for various reasons. That part isn't new. The way that we see social media work, sometimes it gets some of us a little bit alarmed because it's just so easy to spread bad information quickly, misinformation or disinformation. And I like that Sean started out our conversation with those definitions, because disinformation, as we know, it's deliberate, putting information out there on purpose, and misinformation can be, but sometimes it's unintentional. So we spend time in my journalism classes sometimes talking about how we as reporters have a responsibility not to spread misinformation. And that means we, as the mouthpiece or the reporters, it's important for us to stay informed and us to get the best quality information that we can. This is part of our responsibility. So this question is interesting. Earlier today, I was thinking about my habit of cross-referencing information. And it takes me back to English 102 class, where you're asked when you're writing an essay to gather a lot of different sources. You want diverse sources. And when you think you have a fact in front of you, you're supposed to check. Does this source say it's true? Okay, does that other outside source confirm that it's true? Do I have a variety of sources that I trust that say it's true? Now, how do we know we can trust these sources? That's a challenge. And I have students bring this question up a lot. Well, I saw it online. It looked like a reputable website, or I heard someone say it. They sounded like an authority. This is the challenge for us. How do we know? How do we know that we can trust that source? We got to dig a little bit deeper. So it reminded me of my early days as a copy editor. As a copy editor, my job was to receive these articles written by the reporters of our staff and to look through and make any corrections, but more importantly, to pick out the items that looked like fact. Anything that might be fact. And then my job as copy editor was to go cross-reference it, look for another source outside of what this reporter said that confirmed it was true. And my editor would push back on me. My editor would say, I want you to highlight every item in that article, even if you think you know it's true. And he meant, or he or she meant addresses, somebody's title, the way that you spelled a name. Highlight each and every one of these things. And if you saw the pages, they looked kind of ridiculous because in some sentences it would be almost every word. And then the expectation was on me to go find another outside source, confirm the spelling, confirm the address. I mean, I would open the yellow pages, I would have the dictionary out. We had the internet, but they wanted me to use books to fact check. So once I had cross-referenced and fact checked all these things, then, only then could I put my initials on it and approve the article and say it was ready. As a reporter, I absorbed this habit, and now when I write and put something out there, I look everything up. And it takes extra time, but I just want to make sure that I'm not the one that's spreading the misinformation. I don't want to be the cause. It's happened to me in my life. I've put mistakes in print, and I've gotten called out, and I've had to apologize or run a correction. But that's the responsible and ethical thing to do when we realize our mistakes. So going back to social media, this is hard because we know from studying people's patterns, people tend to pick up and read and then share things that already align with their thinking. You know, we get that echo chamber effect. So what's the remedy? Do we need to have more filters in place? Should we have copy editors or fact checkers for all of these social media posts? I don't know. We can look at what the companies have, like Facebook and Twitter have done lately. They do have staff now that are reviewing posts for this misinformation, and they are applying more filters. Is that a good or bad thing? I don't know. We can have a really philosophical talk about that and if it impacts free speech. But I am all for copy editors. When newsrooms started to downsize and we got rid of the copy editors and the proofreaders, I think that was a very scary moment. And I'm glad that we're going back to checking this information. Was that a long answer?
Yeah, I think it was a good answer. And I think it brings up a lot of questions and something I think even us as librarians and maybe faculty have considered too is the idea of quality information and fact checking and things like that. And how some of that might not exist in the same way as online. I don't know, what some of the panelists think as far as that. Do you kind of see kind of maybe that, maybe is that what we're missing, maybe fact checking in some of the social media posts, or is it something else that you guys might be seeing too?
Well, one of the deeper problems that we have is that the very idea of a fact is being disputed. And when the very idea of a fact is disputed, then fact checking itself becomes the part of the division and dispute, as we have witnessed for the last few years.
I think what Jenna said about the role of a journalist is super important. And I think that a lot of people do not understand journalism and how it works. I would recommend that anybody read, I recently read Bronan Farrow's book about Me Too, and there's another one that I don't remember the name, Jodi Kantor, and they essentially wrote books about what was the process of writing the Me Too stories. And if you read these books, you see so much information about what journalists go through in order to get it right, how hard they work, how they talk. Harvey Weinstein had every opportunity over and over again to talk to those people. And I have students tell me all the time, oh, they just make up whatever. And I said, you have no idea how much news they leave on the table because they can't verify it 2 or 3 times. I think people don't understand the role of the traditional media. And so as a mediator, as somebody who stood between all of this content and people and helped inform us about what was true, what was relevant. And I think, it's a real disservice to professional journalists when we don't really know what they're doing and how hard they're working to get all of this right.
I agree, and I think that there's also a big disconnect between what people understand as news and fact-based journalism and editorial. I think there's a big disconnect there, and I think a lot of the news, especially the 24-hour news cycle, where you see certain channels and stations that have a lot of editorialization of the news, gets conflated with fact-based journalism.
Interesting discussion. And it also kind of brings me to kind of the next question is kind of how did we get here? I'm actually going to bring this one up to Terry right now. So, so one of the first questions I wonder about when it comes to the proliferation of misinformation on social media, again, is how did we get here? How did misinformation become such a dominant force in our society? And so I thought I would start out by asking, so what are some of the political and legal reasons for the origins of misinformation in our society? And is there something our government is or is not doing to kind of enable some of these issues? So what do you think from a political science and legal standpoint there?
So I took a bunch of notes on the question and then Jenna stole all my answer. But I'm gonna little bit reiterate some of the stuff she said, which is, propaganda is not new. Dirty tricks by politicians is not new. Conspiracy theories not new. Pervasive anti-intellectualism in America is not new, right? What is new is this huge instantaneous platform to spread all this information without an editor, right? And so, we can look, for those of you who saw Hamilton, we can look back to the story of Alexander Hamilton and how they were publishing these stories about him having affairs and this sort of stuff. People act like politics was ever pure or something like that, right? But we have this we no longer have anybody helping to mediate all that information. And I guess I would look at a couple of trends that have happened over the past 40 or so years that I think sort of primed the pump for people to fall more victim to what happens on social media. The first thing I would talk about is something called the Fairness Doctrine, which there used to be the Federal Communications Commission used to enforce a doctrine that said if like a show like 60 Minutes said something negative about a candidate, the candidate had to be given an opportunity to respond. You had to put both sides of an issue up. And the Reagan administration, because conservatives thought that the media was unfair to them, the media did away with the fairness. The Reagan administration did away with the Fairness Doctrine. And what happens then is you see this rise of sort of these shock jocks on talk radio, because now you can say whatever you want and you don't have to put the other side. And we saw like with Rush Limbaugh, right, coming up with these sorts of things and no responsibility to say what happened in the other side. And then coupled with that, I think you get like these technologies. So you get cable news, you get satellite radio, all of this stuff, and it enables narrowcasting, which is like, I don't have to watch ABC, NBC, or CBS. I can watch whatever tells me what I want to hear. And it used to be that we had these big three networks and they had to appeal to everyone. And so they had to tell, truthful stories that were appealed to a broad swath of people so that they could get the ratings and get the advertising. And now we have people just turning in whatever media it is that they want to hear. We have extreme political polarization in this country that has come about. I mean, that's an entire book in and of itself, but we can talk about how gerrymandering has set up a situation where most members in the House of Representatives now represent a very homogeneous population. And so they play to the most extreme of their constituents because they no longer have a very heterogeneous coalition of people that they're representing. And similarly, lots of, more now than ever, people are self-segregating with other like-minded people. So if you look at those maps we see of who won elections, you see the coasts are blue and the cities are blue and everywhere else is red. And people used to live in the town they were born in, and the guy next door to them had a different political opinion, but they were still best friends and they had to learn to talk to and deal with each other. And so you have sort of like all of these things sort of happening, and then social media sort of explodes into like, here's even more of a place where I can just hear what I want to hear and just listen to what I want to listen to. And as far as what the government's doing about that, what the government's doing about it right now is not much. In 1996, when they passed the Communications Decency Act, which has the Section 230, which is the part that essentially says social media companies are not media companies. And so they don't have any responsibility for the content that goes on their server. I think times were different 25 years ago. The internet was much smaller 25 years ago. And I think people thought, well, it was always going to look like little Reddit forums or something and not like these gigantic monoliths of Twitter and Facebook. So I think we've gotten to the point where the government has to seriously consider regulating these companies in the public interest. So I don't know. I went on for a long time. Did I answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. And I think these are, it speaks though that these are definitely complicated issues. With social media, and one of the things that you think about too is kind of the idea of narrowcasting. And one of the things we've talked about before in some of our fake news sessions is the idea that sometimes algorithms, for instance, will give you kind of the content you want to see as opposed to, the content that might be the most informative or give you the most well-rounded perspective. And speaking of like information bubbles and how people get kind of caught in these things where they're only hearing from one particular side of an argument rather than maybe the more kind of rounded side of an argument. So I don't know, what do you panelists think about some of those ideas, and what do you think? We talk about often we think about algorithms as kind of unbiased things that aren't perpetuating biases. So what kind of role do you think as far as like algorithms and some of this kind of political kind of segregation and information bubbles, what kind of roles do you see that having in some of this problem as well, generally, panelists? Does that question make any sense?
Well, I'm a little, surprised that I have something to add to Terry's contribution here, but I think that one of the major culprits to where we are at now is the green dollar. When media turned into when the news on TV turned into a profitable enterprise, when the news divisions had to become profitable, the whole ballgame changed. Because then the role or the goal of the news of the news division was no longer serving the public, but rather increasing the ratings. And once that mission changed, corruption entered, and it's now basically the whole system is corrupt by the ratings. And the same goes for Sean's question about algorithm. Algorithm serves whoever puts it together. There's nothing miraculous about algorithms. They just simply instructions of do this, don't do that. And instructions are, of course, serving a purpose. And if profit is the only purpose, then that's what they're going to serve. So part of the reason we are here is because gradually media, like many other sectors of our society, religion and other sectors, became profit-generating enterprises.
Yeah, and I think that brings up kind of another question. And next one I got is for you, Peter. And I think one of the questions that comes up is, when considering these problems of misinformation, social media, and free speech, I think there's a lot of things to consider. And some of these questions involving maybe is what is the right or ethical thing to do? In particular, we have two main actors, I think, with some of this problem: social media companies and maybe even our government. So maybe as kind of more from a philosophical or ethical standpoint, what are some of the things that maybe we need to consider when examining like ethical obligations of social media companies when it comes to misinformation and free speech? And what about some of the ethical obligations of maybe our U.S. government and maybe protecting either free speech or us from misinformation?
Censor anybody who we don't like. I'm joking. So, philosophy has become, throughout the last several hundred years, into what you might call the foundational studies of other disciplines. So if we look at this question that Sean raised as kind of like a discipline on its own, then what is the foundation of it? Well, here is the problem. What we face today is an inevitable consequence of a paradox involved in the following, just a few examples. The paradox of democracy, paradox of tolerance, and the paradox of free speech. All of these things, democracy, tolerance, and free speech that we value so much, are inherently paradoxical. Let me give you a very simple account of one of them. They all have the same form. It's just, I give an example of one of them, that a philosopher by the name of Karl Popper put in a footnote, by the way, that generated massive amount of literature in a book that he wrote in the, I believe it was late 30s, or 37 maybe, or something like that. And that's the paradox of tolerance. So let's imagine that we have a society which adopts the policy of unrestricted tolerance, in which case they have to tolerate the intolerant, thereby leaving open the possibility of the intolerant taking over and eliminating tolerance. On the other hand, if the society decides that they would put restrictions on the intolerant, then they betray their own supposed principle of being tolerant of the very views they disagree with, because tolerance only matters for those views that you disagree with. You don't tolerate views that you agree with, you accept them. So this is what is called the principle of the paradox of tolerance. There is also a paradox of free speech, which has exactly the same form, Namely, imagine a society that adopts an unrestricted policy of free speech. Then what you get is those who are intolerant of free speech, oppose it. And if they take over, they will eliminate free speech. So it's self-destructive. On the other hand, if the society that promotes free speech decides to restrict free speech, then they seem to betray their own principles. So that's what is called the paradox of free speech, tolerance. The same goes for democracy. Democracy is very interesting because the very things that this paradox predicts actually happened in several countries. For example, Hungary and Poland used to be the beginning of democracies, and now they are autocracies, or what is called autocratic legalism. Anti-democratic parties took over and used the democracy first to take over, and then used the legal system and changed it to keep power perpetually. So why am I pointing this foundational problem up? Because all of these things that we value include paradoxes, and these paradoxes tell us that we always have to be diligent about preserving these values. And there are only two ways we can do that. One way is to make sure that the institutions we have promote the virtues associated with free speech, tolerance, democracy, etc. Like, for example, the education institutions, which unfortunately, due to the new influence from Wall Street, they changed their mission. And many of these institutions became more about educating students for their first job. And always I look at that, the job is actually for me means a consumer. And when that student goes out and gets the job, and then 2-3 years later loses it, they are no longer able to consume, so the society spits them out. The same goes for all the other institutions. The media already mentioned in regards to what Terry was talking about before. We were not diligent about instilling the right virtues in the population that will naturally preserve the values of free speech, tolerance, democracy, etc. The other option is to decide to impose restrictions on those who are intolerant, who oppose free speech, or undermine it by undermining the whole notion of truth and fact, and thereby in some way getting into the new debate about, well, how can those who promote free speech impose restrictions on free speech? So what I'm trying to say, the lesson of what we experience today, and then, by the way, the focus on the media, on the social media, is only because the device, as some mentioned previously, is just able to perpetuate and very quickly falsehood. And we know falsehood are distributed faster than truth. But the problem itself is inherent. And these are the only two ways to solve it. And I say that we failed to solve it in the proper way as a society. As educators, we failed. As citizens, we failed. And the lesson is we need to be diligent. This is a perpetual problem of democracy, of tolerance, of free speech. It's not something that will go away with some miracle drug or some solution. There is no miracle solution. The only solution there is constant vigilance, the proper education, the right way of building the institutions. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Does anyone have any thoughts about some of these paradoxes Peter raised?
I do, and I'm curious to hear from some of the other panelists and Terry especially on this. I like where Peter's going with this. It brought to my mind the question, do social media companies have an ethical obligation? Do they have an ethical obligation to monitor? We see that they're doing that now. They're taking down the bad posts. But if they're meant to be forums for free public expression, this monitoring, this filtering, does that impose on free speech? And I know what, I can almost hear the answers from some of my students. I know what some of my students might say. On the other hand, we're saying that if we want to only perpetuate the good information, then we do have an obligation to take down anything that we find to be untrue or misinformation, and that kind of filter should be in place. And I think some of our conversation has indicated that some of us feel there should maybe be more regulation. What does the panel and what does some of our participants think about this? And I also just want to point out the differences. The news media and social media are not the same thing, and we shouldn't be treating them in these conversations like they are. The news media it's an entity separate from social media. The rules of the game are different. Social media companies in large part exist because they're companies. They exist to make money and earn a profit. So I just want to make that distinction. And I also wanted to tie some of this conversation to some of the comments we're getting from a participant, Silas. He pointed out that it's been said Generation Z is perhaps the most tolerant generation in human history. And then he asks, and I'm sorry if I'm assuming you're he or she or they, asks, assuming this is true, what negative side effects come with this amount of tolerance in society? I think that's a very interesting question.
Well, I do not know the answer to that question, but I do. I would say that in terms of regulating social media companies, I mean, the First Amendment, like the Second Amendment, none of these things are absolute. Okay, I teach civil rights and civil liberties, and I always say we wouldn't have a class if it was really true that when it says Congress shall make no law, because we have all sorts of recognized exceptions to free speech that are basically based on the fact that some speech has very little social value. There is very little social value in smearing people's reputations. There is low social value in obscenity. There is low social value in false or misleading advertising. So there's all sorts of exceptions that we as a society have made, and the Supreme Court has carved out in terms of, regulating speech. I'm like, I'm very, very interested in protecting free speech from the government. But again, Twitter is not the government. And so Twitter can decide as its own platform that I do think that they have an ethical duty. Currently, they don't really have a legal duty. And I think we're at the point where the danger they pose is enough that we ought to consider giving them some form of a legal duty.
And I think this is actually a pretty good segue for my last introductory question, and this is to Jackie. So as a librarian, former journalist, and writer for ALA's Intellectual Freedom blog, you've written extensively about the importance of intellectual freedom. So does misinformation have a role in harming the intellectual freedom of some groups? How do you think we as a society can preserve intellectual freedom and free speech while also protecting ourselves from the dangers of misinformation? And how does the idea of cancel culture that's been tossed around relate to intellectual freedom? What do you think, Jackie?
Thanks, Sean. Yeah, I mean, I think about these issues all the time, and I wrote down some notes so I could kind of be cohesive in my answers to these questions. But when it comes to misinformation, and that is misinformation with no basis in fact, I don't think it really does harm anyone's intellectual freedom if organizations, specifically social media organizations, are trying to curb its spread, because when we look at intellectual freedom, we see it as a way to open up dialogue about beliefs, ideas, information. And when those concepts start to veer into the realm of like lies, propaganda, misinformation, we're kind of doing a disservice to the spirit of intellectual freedom. And we move into a realm of direct manipulation. And so that I see as the propagation of provenly false information. So when we're debating within the spirit of intellectual freedom, we can have disagreements and we can expand the dialogue. When we operate inside, and this is something Peter talked about, when we operate inside a common set of facts. Once we remove this common set of facts and folks with an agenda replace them with disinformation or misinformation, we are being manipulated. And there's really no way to debate in good faith with manipulators. So even those we might think are experts in a field, for instance, if they're operating outside of the consensus of their expertise, and their own professional communities, they're usually operating with an agenda. So, for example, if you're taking information and advice from an emergency room doctor about how COVID-19 spreads and how this virus spreads, an emergency room doctor is not a virologist or an infectious disease doctor, and that's why we have specialists within the field of medicine. So when you think about things like that, when not all doctors are experts in all fields of medicine. So we have to remember that too, when we're looking at expertise and who's sharing this misinformation or disinformation, even though they may seem like an authority, they are not always. So I think that when preserving intellectual freedom and free speech, it's really about making sure, as Terry said, making sure that the government entities do not control the types of information that can be shared. So whether that's through traditionally published means or any sort of self-publishing, whether that's self-publishing a book or self-publishing a blog or self-publishing on social media, this also includes government regulation compelling certain organizations to or not to publish or disseminate any sort of information, So for example, I'll give you one example of something that recently came up called the Grinch Act. And so a congressperson from Pennsylvania, I think it's Pennsylvania, proposed a bill, and it says, and I'll read it, it says, this legislation would prohibit states and local government agencies from receiving funding under the Student Support and Academic Enrichment Grants Program if they ban books. So this Republican congressperson said that if entities ban books, but what is his definition of banning a book? Because I would venture to say that based on current trends, many people that support this bill would be fine with banning LGBTQ books or books that share information on LGBTQ families and topics, but then they have outrage when children's books that have clearly racist images within their pages are banned. So what really are our values when we're talking about this kind of so-called banning? And then we look at the confusion surrounding free speech. So when we talk about intellectual freedom, we're talking about sharing ideas. We can't share those ideas on social media because they go against a policy regarding fact-checking or hate speech. We're not really prohibited from sharing that information other ways, right? I mean, we can go somewhere else and share that information. We can start our own blog. We can start our own webpage. So as long as that's the case, I do believe that intellectual freedom holds. And I also think that if the damage that's done by misinformation outweighs its value for public discourse, I think it makes sense for that companies want to restrict its propagation. For example, the damage that is continuously and systemically done to both Asian American and Pacific Islander and Black communities by the racist stereotypes, for example, portrayed in certain Dr. Seuss books that were just recently put out of print. Like, sure, we can still see them and study them from a primary source outlook or looking at the history of, racist imagery in children's books, but do these books really belong in our, on our shelves for children to access and to get and to see when these are perpetuating a system that we are currently trying to dismantle for the equity and dignity of all people? So, it's just about context, right? And then to get to your cancel culture question, first, I just want to make sure that I say that people should be reading Black, Indigenous, and people of color educators on this issue. Many BIPOC educators have been saying for a very long time, that cancel culture is a fallacy. No one has been canceled. They've been called out, they've been called to held account. So it's more accurately, I would say, it should more accurately be called accountability culture, because it's just calling somebody out and saying, hey, there's consequences for this behavior. So I'll refer you to individuals like Sarah Haji and Nasreen Malik, who wrote pieces in both Time Magazine and The Guardian, respectively, Dr. Akila Cadet, Sonia Renee Taylor, and Ijoma Uluo, who talk about accountability culture. And this is just a few of the BIPOC educators who are constantly talking about it and have information to share and have written extensively about it. And then I want to say that what they're saying is that accountability culture and call out culture is a good thing for everybody, because when people are held to power, are also held to account for what may cause harm, people are better off, right? And then people who decry a culture of accountability are the people who want to continue the status quo and perpetuate traditional power structures that are entrenched in white supremacy. And I will add too that the idea and the construct of free speech was really intended for white people. It did not bring into, when these ideas were being drafted, and we weren't considering this equity culture and dismantling white supremacy. And I think without kind of looking at that, examining it, and trying to understand how these values of free speech actually can harm people, we really have to take a look at that. And what I say is that very few who hold traditional power have had to account for something that they've said with their life. Very few. And when we look at people who are marginalized, they don't have free speech the way that white people feel that they have free speech. So I think that that's an important thing and an important lens that we have to look at. So that's what I have to say.
A lot of great and fascinating points there, Jackie. Were you saying something,
We do
Jen?
have some questions, or did anybody else want to respond to that before we get to some attendee questions? Okay, well, let's take a look at a few attendee or audience questions that we have today. The first one, what responsibility does the public have in its own social media diet and role in sifting through fake news to get to the truth? I might just start this off, and I'll say civic engagement. Civic engagement is a responsibility of any active citizen, with the understanding of the privilege that's inherent in that as well, and the roadblocks that many people do have as far as either access or education or an understanding. And so without possibly some of the skills being taught early on in how to decipher information, that can really hold people back from being accountable for their own social media and understanding of information.
I think I would add, Pam, that's a really good point. And also, it's I definitely appreciate personal responsibility and people doing the work, but also I think we have to bear in mind that a lot of this is very specifically calculated to fool people, to confuse people, to manipulate people. And when you have a populace that to a large part is ill-educated, that is working a million hours a day just to stay afloat, and then we give them the job of content editor to figure out what's true and what's not true. I don't think that that's an expectation that we can really put on average people to try to untangle these webs of deceit and for-profit businesses manipulating us. I mean, if you guys watch that movie, that's the other extra credit that is in conjunction with this. I mean, people are being paid to spread misinformation, and that is their day job. And most of us have another day job, and we don't necessarily have the ability to spend our entire day job, trying to disprove or verify what they're saying. So I would just kind of echo what you said, Pam.
Yeah, if I may answer this in a very indirect way, the public responsibilities, civic responsibility would be to educate themselves in history and civics. But once again, Terry stole my line. Of course, most of the public we're talking about are people who have to work 2, 3 jobs. Certain ideologies won out. I won't mention which one they are, but I already said education, our education institutions. What are we hearing as the main mission today in our education institution? Jobs, jobs, jobs. And I want to, if there's one thing that you remember of what I said, remember this. Anytime that education institutions talk about jobs, they actually mean consumers. Remember that. And the minute the economy changes, which now changes very fast, those jobs are gone. We did not educate these people how to adapt to a very fast-paced economy. They become basically non-consumers and society spits them out. So it would be nice if the public could educate themselves in history and in civics. Notice I didn't say philosophy, although of course that's the foundation of everything. But I say it is our responsibility, educators, to resist this ideology of Wall Street that turned our education institutions into producers of people that have to work 1, 2, 3 jobs a day, and therefore they can't educate themselves and really understand what's happening to them. So my answer is, it's on us.
Thank you, Peter. That actually related to another question we had from attendee on that given the panel opened with the coup attempt of January 6th, what culpability do faculty, staff, and administration have in shifting the ideological focus of higher education to vocational training, as Peter was just describing, as opposed to democracy training, a previously sacrosanct role of the academy? Would anyone else like to enter in a response to that?
Oh, sorry, am I cutting someone off? No, okay. I like what both Peter and Terry had to say, and then it got me thinking, how are we going to do this? Okay, well, I want to embrace the approach of the influencers, and I think all of us, including the panelists that are participating, all of us educators, staff, and those of you that chose to participate today, we can send the word out. We can get the message out about critical thinking and not just accepting anything that's put in front of us as the truth. Do you remember when your mom said, don't judge a book by its cover? Or maybe your mom didn't say that. Mine did to me because she was an English teacher. So, but the point is, you can't just look at, I mean, some covers don't even have a picture on them. How are you supposed to know what's inside? You open the cover, you start to read the pages. You're taking this in, right? You're ingesting the information. We can be our own copy editors. We can be our own filters. We can take a little bit of extra time. And I know it's hard when you're a student. I know my students like to take shortcuts. I took shortcuts when I was a college student too. Whenever I could try to make something go by faster, get it done quicker. But I think we all need to just pause and put in the extra time, push back on this information that we're receiving, test it, and not just accept it because it sounds good. and we can spread this message to our friends. I wish that Ed were here with us in this conversation. I remember a few years ago, he had shared with us. So someone in the comments had asked, how do you fight this misinformation that gets spread so easily on social media? And do we, as consumers of social media, do we have a responsibility? Ed shared that he knew he was looking at all of his friends' posts and his friends, because his friends agreed with him on things that were political. So Ed, one of our librarians, he said he intentionally started to friend and accept people that had different political views or were on the other side from his way of thinking. And he did that intentionally as a balance, so he could see what their argument was and process it. And I thought that was really smart. I just really like that. I know not everyone is going to do that. It's hard. It's not comfortable. And like Peter said, and like Terry said, a lot of us are working a lot. But we should make the time, right, to sift and sort through the information. Anyway, I would like to call us all to action here to spread this idea of critical thinking and testing the information that we get.
And I'll just say briefly, just a logistical thing. So we did put a little form in the chat. So if you're looking to get extra credit for attendance for today, please click on that form, just fill out some information. And you'll definitely get that. And I don't know if we have maybe time for maybe one more question, Pam. What do you think?
Sure, and I'm not seeing that link in the chat for everybody, so I'm going to put it in just one more time. That's basically a Google form. So if you are attending today for extra credit, it will give us the info on what instructors need to be informed that you joined us. Probably, I think the next question that came in order, if we have last couple of minutes, in order to overcome the issue of misinformation on social media without government intervention, what can be done? If government steps in, then there will never be 100% acceptance of their actions, probably with good reason. So that was part of the question. Agree, disagree?
I think it's an interesting question. I'd just like to weigh in maybe a little bit too. So what can be done without government intervention? I'll just say one thing. I think people as consumers have more power than you necessarily give yourself credit for. And by consumers, I mean users of these services. The reason why social media is starting to tackle this is because people want social media to tackle this. It's not because they have an inherent drive for them to do it themselves. I think that's one of the things we want to keep in mind too, that we are powerful actors in this process. That's the only thing I'll add, and I don't know if anyone had any else to.
I think that's a good point to make. If you know, we're a capitalist society, and you know, I have to laugh at the sort of cancel culture thing because, right, we're always being told by the purveyors of capitalism how great the market is. And then when the market says, okay, well, you said something that we don't like and we disapprove of, so we don't want to buy your stuff or we don't want to support you, now it's cancel culture, which is it's actually exactly how all these people say the markets are supposed to work, and it's so great. Right? When you live in a country where the government institutions have failed us so much, as Peter described, well, now we sort of have the market, and we do have a lot of power as consumers, and I think that's, you know, that's important to remember. But I also, well, I understand people have a healthy fear of the government, and I certainly have a healthy fear of the government regulating speech. I think we've gotten a little bit to the point in this country where we've decided that government is always evil and government can't do anything right, and we should resort to the private sector to solve all of our problems. And I think we've seen what happens when states like Texas decide to just abdicate their job as a government, where we decide to do nothing. Our response to coronavirus, all of these things happening, the infrastructure in this country, government can be a force for good. We have to hold it accountable. But to say that, government has no role in the few things that our founding fathers wanted it to do, I don't want to jump on that bandwagon. And I just want to toss out one thing, because I saw something in the chat about Dr. Seuss. I just want to point out, for those who don't know, the Dr. Seuss estate itself decided to stop publishing those books. It was their choice as the people who guard the reputation of Dr. Seuss, Ted Geisel, I think his name is, that they didn't want to be seen as him to go down in history as perpetuating those things. So whatever, that's nobody canceled him except himself, and he didn't cancel him, he just grew, or his estate representing him grew. So I just wanted to toss that out somewhat unrelatedly. Thank you.
I want to just add something I heard that is really very interesting, or a good way of thinking about regarding the government that Terry was talking about. So there is this always debate between big government and small government, and a very, very smart happens to be journalist. I can't remember his name right now. He pointed out that the question is not about big government or small government. It's a question about good government. What constitutes good government? The debate, small and big, is like, I always ask these people, some of them are friends of mine who think government should be small. I said, how small? Like Luxembourg's? Small? I mean, what do we exactly mean by small or big, like how? So it's really a good government. And now, when you talk about good government, talk about the values of a society. When you talk about the values of a society, because good only means a government that promotes the right kind of values and policies that promote flourishing of people. Ultimately, the goal of government is to create the conditions in which people can flourish. And so if we measure that in that way, if we have this, what I call social covenant, not contract, but covenant, we have a social covenant in which we agree to this covenant where the role of the government is to promote those policies and values that enhance human flourishing. We'll be able to get over all these problems. Not forever, because as Popper said, the philosopher Karl Popper, we are fallible, and therefore we always going to create things that have errors in them. But at least we can improve. We are now went so much back in the last few years, maybe 25 years, that it's very hard to see how we can go forward. And the only way I can see it is if we redefine our agreement as a social covenant to promote certain values that enhance human flourishing.
I think that's an excellent point, and I think that'll be the excellent point in which we end on today. It looks like we respect everybody's time, and we reached the end of this panel. All that said, I do want to thank all of our amazing panelists. I think you had some great insights, great perspectives, and it was wonderful to have you guys attend. And I also want to thank all the participants who attended as well. Thank you for all your great questions, for participating today. And with all that said, one last virtual cheer to our panelists today, and one virtual cheer, I guess, to the participants as well. Thank you so much for joining us today. And if you haven't, check out that video. It's another part of this kind of our fake news and misinformation things for this semester. And it's great to have all you on, and have an excellent afternoon.
Sean, next time do not put do not place a time limit on a panel like this, on a topic like this. It should be forever.
I know we could honestly talk about this all day, but yeah, I don't, yeah, maybe next time we'll go longer for sure.
All right. Well, thank you so much for organizing it. Thank everybody who participated and asked questions. It was fun.
Thanks, Peter.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Thank you.